Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I awoke to the sound of my mother dying. At least that's what I thought, as I woke up as suddenly as if I'd been drenched in ice water.
Help! Oh my God, help me!
I flew upstairs and into her bedroom. Mom was coiled in her bedsheets, writhing like a beached fish, thrashing her head against the pillow.
Please, help me! It's back! It's back! Oh God, no!
I ran over to her side and shook her. Mom, it's a nightmare, wake up! Her bouts of night terrors were nothing new either, but forcing her out of them was always a heart-wrenching ordeal. It's Fran, Mom, there's nothing here.
Don't let it take me,
she cried. I had to stop myself from slapping her. Wake up now, I commanded, trying to wrench the sheets off of her. She suddenly shot up, fully alert.
Where am I? Who are you? I don't know you.
I'm your daughter, Fran, remember? I shouted, unable to restrain my fears, my frustrations. Remember me!
I have no daughter. My family's dead,
she spat, curling away from me.
They're all dead, and I'm next. It's coming for me. It's outside right now.
Mom, I'm here, I cried. But my voice died as my eyes broke from her and darted over to the window. Its face was pressed into the glass, yellow eyes gleaming with hunger. I could see down its throat, florid and ravenous. I swear I could hear the snowy owl laugh. Get away! I roared, crossing over to the window and banging on the glass. It flapped those huge wings but remained rooted in place. I laid flat-handed blows on the panes right over it. The owl was unfazed.
Stop it. I want to die,
Mom wailed. Enough of this, I snapped. I left my floundering mother in the bedroom and stomped downstairs to the fireplace, grabbing the only weapon my frenzied mind could comprehend. Wasting no time, I barged outside, my adrenaline a force field of heat against the bitter, soggy cold. The snowy owl was still plastered over my mother's bedroom window. Her screams had taken on a muffled, haunting quality. Get out of here! I shouted, wielding the poker like a sword. The owl ignored me. Some snide voice cut through the panic, chiding me for assuming the owl would listen. Shut up, I told it back. It found us, didn't it? There's something weird about this bird. I took a breath, tensed my arm, drew back and launched the poker with all my strength. Leave her alone! The clang was like a church bell. Snow dislodged from the roof and nearby trees. The owl went still. For an incredulous instant, I thought I had actually made contact. I expected it to drop pitifully to the ground, its white coat broken and deepening with the red of death. It turned its head all the way around. Once more, I was met with those eyes. The air between us just folded, and suddenly it was on top of me. Spread out flat in the snow like a crime scene, the weapon gone from my hand, I could only stare in horror at the owl striding over me. It had grown. It was the size of a tiger now, its massive wings enveloping me in a feathery shroud. It stared right back, with eyes the size and color of lemons, those cavernous pupils swallowing me whole. The hiss billowing from its beak was an abyssal rattle like the mother of serpents. It squeezed my arms with its scaly feet, pinning me down. It lowered its neck. No! I managed to cry, but that scythe-like beak stabbed downward. I'd never been shot before, but I've read about what it's like. It's not just the pain of entry. It's your innards absorbing the force of the round and jostling loose, liquefying. You literally shatter from the inside. That's what it was like. Feeling that demonic owl dig through my breast and scrape against bone. The agony was excruciating. I knew I'd die. I just knew I'd die right there on that snowy night. there was the sickening crack of my ribs splintering and breaking under its strength. Burning blood poured down my sides as a million raining knives massacred my chest and my skull. Everything else was twisted and strained from screaming. It finally lifted its face from the hole in my body. Something was struggling in its beak. I thought it was alive, something malformed and premature, but each movement was disturbingly rhythmic. 2 squirms, stillness. 2 squirms, stillness. A pulse, a heartbeat. The realization brought only darkness. The owl took flight, my heart trailing blood and shredded sinews underneath it. I weakly reached out for it, my arm trembling as I tried to touch it, to reclaim what was stolen. Death came quickly. It was the best sleep I ever knew. Waking up in my bed the next morning shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did. It had all felt so real. I had truly experienced the pain of death, of animalistic mutilation. I felt cursed with forbidden knowledge, unworthy to be walking around and breathing, burdened with what I knew. Instinctively, I ran my hand down my forearm, grazing over the band-aids I had applied myself. That had definitely been real, the first attack. Maybe it was broody or territorial. I don't know. I didn't really care, to be honest. Mom's episode from the night before hit me next, and I sprung out of bed. But I heard the characteristic noises of her shuffling through the kitchen. She didn't sound injured or impeded in any way. I knew her well enough to tell. If that had been real, it had clearly de-escalated. I headed to the bathroom and gazed into the mirror. As if hypnotized, I pulled back my nightgown to reveal nothing. Unmarked, unblemished skin. Well, maybe that wasn't entirely accurate, as age and time spared no one. But no indication that some beastly owl had ripped through my chest and bitten out my heart. Satisfied, I took to removing the band-aids. They unstuck rather painlessly, and I turned on the faucet to dab away any fresh blood. No blood. Not even any scabbing. I could see straight down the wounds inside my arm. I brushed my fingertips across the wounds. No pain. Scowling, I pressed a nail into the soft flesh. It elicited no sensation, no fresh stream of blood. I jabbed the skin on my other forearm. I felt nothing. I laid my palms on my face. I was cold, ice cold. Finally struck with a horrible thought, I pressed my finger to my neck. I waited, counting. "My God," I whispered. "No." Readjusting my gown, I rushed into the kitchen where Mom was picking at her burnt toast. "Mom, quick, can you feel my heartbeat?" It took her a while to set her breakfast down and look up. "What?" "I don't feel my pulse," I said. "I feel nothing." Mom cocked her head as she stared at me. "And you are?" I sighed. "Fran, I'm Fran, your daughter." Mom looked away. "I don't have a daughter." I took a deep breath. "My name is Fran Wilcox. I was born to you, Marie Bernard Wilcox, on January 3rd, 1969. My father, your husband, was Dave Wilcox, who passed away January 14th of this year." Mom pushed away her toast. She then looked back at me. "No, you're just another ghost." She ignored me as I rushed to the kitchen counter and drew a steak knife from the rack, slicing it across my palm. It cut through my flesh as easily as a slab of raw pork. I could see the flayed skin, the reddish layers underneath. No blood, no pain. I checked my pulse again. No, please God, no. I stormed outside. The snow was still on the ground. I could see perfectly where I had struggled. The discarded black poker sticking out of the ground, and bizarre markings to the sides of my impressions, like giant wings taking off. I trembled at the knees, but not from the cold. In a traumatized haze, I wandered back inside, hand over my heart, or where it used to be. Mom was lolling in her chair, cringing away from me.
"You're letting in the cold," she growled. "Try as you might, but I'm still here. You're not taking me like this."
"I'm not dead," I insisted. It shocked me how little of an emotional upheaval I'd mustered, trying to convince my ailing mother that her daughter wasn't some unknowable ghost should have been heartbreaking, but there was nothing there to break. "Mom, listen to me. I'm your daughter. I'm still here. My heart's been stolen."
"I'm alone,"
she replied, shaking her head and looking around.
"I'm alone in this strange place. I have nothing to say to you. Now go away."
"Mom," I said, laying a hand on her shoulder. She turned in her chair and backhanded me in the face. Only the force alone sent me reeling. There was no stinging pain, no upwelling of sorrow, only coldness, a strange middling thread of anger. Mom got up and hobbled into the living room.
"Nobody loves me,"
she muttered.
"Everybody's gone. They left me because I'm old and useless and about to die."
The anger consumed me. "Then die, you miserable bitch!" I fled into the snowy dawn, forcing tears that never came, screaming primal roars that failed to rip apart my throat. I cursed my mother. I cursed the snow that squelched and crunched unfeelingly below my bare feet. And most of all, I cursed the mysterious, hellish raptor that had doomed me to this absurd fate. Deep in the forest, laid before me in its wintry slumber, I waited for the owl. I dared it to come for me again, to steal something else that belonged to me, that would have made me whole. Time passed. The bird didn't show. I must have spent hours in those woods waiting for the owl. I could have spent weeks, months even, haunting the forest and desiring retribution. I seemed to lack the hardware for impatience. Yet, when I finally drifted back to the cabin, not even 2 minutes had gone by. Time was cruel to something like me. I found my mother sitting in the living room, her rosary draped around one hand. She rocked in her chair, eyes closed, lips moist from nervous licking.
"Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Ah, look at what the cold blew in."
Mom glanced up from her rosary at my presence, her expression scrunched as if there were a bad smell in the air.
"You must think this is amusing. Here I am, trying to recall my sins for the last time, and you're hanging over my shoulder like a buzzard."
She frowned.
"Hail Mary, full of... oh, blast it."
She fumbled with the rosary, her fingers slipping down the decades.
"Hail Mary, full of grace. Hail Mary. Hail..."
Mom set her hands down in frustration.
"And now I can't finish my prayers. God has left me too."
"No one's left you," I whispered. "I love you. I'm here." Mom cocked her head and grunted.
"Must have been the wind. How could the wind love anything?"
She stood and shambled away from me.
"It's cold in here. So cold."
I watched her stumble about. I elicited no pity for her. Her own bitterness was infectious, filling the heartless hole in my body. Was this the owl's plan? Cursing me into watching my mother break down before me, unable to muster even the tiniest emotional response. "I don't know why this is happening," I tried saying. Mom gave no inclination that she was listening. "I didn't ask for this, though. I loved you, and you loved me back when I had my heart. If you can take one thing away from all this, it's that you matter. You matter a whole lot to a whole lot of people who are here and who aren't here. You can't live so long without mattering to people, Mom. Listen to me. I'm calling you Mom. That matters, please. Please understand. Mom lowered herself into another chair. The rosary dangled from her finger, quivering like a leaf.
So cold, she muttered. You sound so cold. Miserable. I don't believe you. Whatever you are, you've died twice, and I refuse to be like you.
My palms itched, thinking about grabbing and shaking her until the dusty filling spilled out of her hateful pores. I turned away, eyes closed, racking my mind for a response. So, I finally said, what can I do to make you believe me? Mom shook her head.
Leave me alone.
No, I said. I won't leave you like this. Mom pursed her lips. She went very still. The rosary dangled by a single bead from her fingertip. Hunting down the owl was out of the question. Getting through to my mother was impossible, especially with my current predicament. It was true. I had no love to offer. I was an empty vessel spewing empty words. But I had time. All the time and patience in the world to play out this newly assigned role. A shade, a haunting presence opposite of her, to whom time had become meaningless as well. I sat across from Mom, gazing deeply. I watched the shadows creep across the room as the hours ticked by, as the light became golden and finally faded away as night infected the cabin. Her lightly colored clothes rendered her an opaque ghost in the gloom. And through all that time, I stewed in deathly thought. Looking at my mother, all I sensed was static. Rapidly moving parts, the vague suggestion of images. She had been forgetting things for a few years now, but now it seemed she couldn't remember how to live, how to be. She was just drifting through the motions, a tumbleweed through a barren plain. Looking at my mother, staring her in the face for hours, I saw the ravages of her condition. She had completely forgotten about her family, her home, her place in the world. All the bonds she once held, splintered and dissipated into sawdust. At some point in the night, even the rosary slipped from her fingers and coiled in a knotted heap on the floor. I regarded it. Barely a few seconds earlier, it had been a source of comfort for her. It had once belonged to her mother, a medium between woman and God. Now discarded plastic and metal splayed across the carpet. It's worse than death, I realized. Living some fuzzy, vegetative half-life, reduced to mere smidgens of your reptilian brain, held together by your failing carnal husk. All the memories forged, all the love made and lost, collapsing columns of ash long behind you. Is this what I'd been overlooking? I wondered. She was suffering, or on the cusp of it. In my cursed state, forced to look at her, it was easy for me to see just how readily dementia could muddy one's spirit. Given a few more years, I realized, I wouldn't even need to have my heart stolen for her to see me this way. Maybe this isn't a curse, I thought.
Whatever you are, you've died twice.
Her voice in my mind hissed. Where had I heard those words before? It hit me, an old maxim. They say you die twice, once when you stop breathing, and once when your name is uttered for the last time. That's what it was. Her family, the world. It wasn't just dead to my mother at this point. It was twice dead. I turned to look out the window. Snow was falling again. The owl was out there somewhere, even if it refused to show itself. It was biding its time, waiting, watchful and knowing with those wise eyes. I stood up. I understand now. Do what you need to do. I won't interfere. Mom raised her head. Her bony hands gripped the armrests. Then she rose. She began to walk towards the back porch.
I'm tired,
she said. She was still slow and unwieldy, but there was a determination this time. Focus, drive. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the blistering night. I trailed her, not making a sound. I had to see it through myself. I couldn't feel the cold, but somehow I doubted she could either. Mom stopped at the edge of the black forest, obscured by the buffeting snowflakes. The only sign of life was the brief mist of her breath, catching and fading in the wind. She waited. I waited. I'm ready. I'm ready now, I declared. We both are. There were two things about owls that would come to strike me as fascinating. First, the fact that their wings and body shapes are especially designed to flight in nearly complete silence, a most wonderful adaptation for a stealthy night hunter. Second, despite their status as cultural icons all around the world, they always stand for something different depending on where you are. Misfortune, mischief, death, good luck, wisdom. They're captivating in that sense. They catch the eye and make you stop and quiet down and ponder. You walk away a different person after seeing an owl. Regardless, I think they stand for one thing no matter who you ask: change. I saw the snowy owl emerge from the trees, its broad ivory wings like iridescent paddles of light, as it soared down and landed on my mother's shoulders, soundless, graceful. It hurt to watch. I realized that with a shock. It was beginning to hurt in my chest. My neck ticked with a pulse. My palm stung. I could feel droplets of fresh blood blooming on the wound. When it took off, I had to blink. It could have been the snowstorm forming patterns. It truly looked like there was a woman in the owl's talons. She was old, peaceful and lucid, fully aware and willing of what was coming. The owl melted back into the trees. The figure it was carrying disappeared with it. Back on the ground, my mother collapsed. I rushed towards her, frigid tears on my face, my heart newly heavy and freshly crushed. The snow was cold on my feet. She was warm in my arms. I carried her back inside. Her expression was calm. She might have been asleep, dreaming of the memories she'd lost in life. I laid her on my bed. I cried long past the sunrise. Dealing with death is difficult as it is. It's messy. It's painful. It stabs you when you least expect it, sending fresh agony through your body. Few things are worse, but those few things are all too real. I saw it for myself, and I could see, looking into her face, that she had passed on knowing that she mattered, and she was loved, especially by her daughter Fran.
The rank aroma of something rotted, like maggot-infested roadkill underneath the blistering summer sun, slams into his nostrils. No, it smells like the spoiled packages of hamburger he discovered in the refrigerator after his mother's death. He waves his arms to dissipate the odor before leaning over to lift the window pane for fresh air. It is stuck from years of numerous coats of paint and neglect. Bending down, he turns on the small fan, pissed when nothing happens. Maybe a rat crawled inside the walls and died? Did the unwanted visitor chew through the wires too? Siri, remind me to call an exterminator in the morning. No response. He tries again and gets the same result before realizing the phone is dead and plugs it into the closest outlet. Time for an upgrade. Battery life is pathetic on these older models. Good thing I've got plenty of cash to spend on things now. Thanks, Mother, for emptying your bank account and stashing all the money inside the house. Makes things simpler and nothing to report to the IRS. Glancing at his watch, he blinks twice. Irked, it has stopped working. He looks back over at the laptop. Confusion swirls inside his overtired brain. How does 7 hours vanish without his awareness of the passing of time? A growling stomach reminds him he hasn't eaten since breakfast. Did he miss the food delivery driver while immersed in writing? Siri, check status of order from Instacart. Again, dead silence. The screen remains black despite being plugged in. Why is it not charging? The overhead lights are on and the rumble of the heating system filters through the thin walls, so there's power. Mental and physical exhaustion coupled with hunger bears down on his body. blocking the creative section of the mind and obliterating any chances of conjuring cohesive thoughts, much less a readable sentence. The exorbitant price paid for the high-oxygen permeability contacts designed specifically for people with dry eyes and astigmatism was a waste of money because they are stuck to a set of sore, gritty corneas while he stared for hours without blinking at the monitor while non-existent people spewed out their experiences and thoughts through his fingers. Eager to move to another room and away from the rank stench, he snatches up the laptop and energy drink on the desk, entering the living room. He sips the last dribbles of the tepid liquid while situating himself on the couch, scanning the document on the screen titled Death Arrives on Black Wings by George Rayburn, and scowls. Garbage. Absolute drivel. Boring rhetoric composed of dated plot lines and regurgitated tropes. None of this is frightening on any level. A complete waste of my time and energy. I thought rattling around inside this freaking dump would help me unleash a genuine piece of horror. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Damn. The doorbell chimes, giving him pause before hitting the delete button. After minimizing the screen, he rises, the dilapidated wood floors creaking underneath his heavy footsteps while walking through the small intertwining rooms until arriving at the front door. Dust and dirt flitter in his wake, but he does not care. Beams of moonlight filter through the windows, casting shimmering rays across the panes and shabby curtains. For a split second, it looks like wraiths swaying in a macabre dance dressed in dingy white. When alive, his mother's housekeeping skills were abysmal, and he inherited Patrice Nanette Rayburn's aversion to cleaning. Besides, it would be a waste of time to clean and declutter, since he plans on selling the shithole once it serves the purpose of inspiring the horror novel. He cannot wait to get out of Little Rock and back to Pensacola. He opens the door, flicks on the light, and scans the ramshackle porch, searching for the delivery box of food. A crow squawks to his left. No, not a crow. A raven. A huge black thing with hints of blue, long skinny legs and thick talons, perched on the railing. He waves his arms and the creature flaps its wings, disappearing into the shadowy night. George jumps when noticing a slender elderly man to his right, standing inches away with a strange vapid look on his wrinkled face, a grocery bag clasped in his hands. Shit! I didn't see you. Are you the delivery man? Good evening, Mr. Rayburn. Pardon me for startling you, and no, I'm not. I'm your neighbor. George looks past the geezer and out toward the street. Did you see a package in the driveway? I'm expecting a grocery delivery. No packages, I'm afraid. This old neighborhood is in a bad part of town and porch pirates are in full swing this year. Your mother had deliveries stolen all the time. Damn economy. If it's any consolation, I brought beer and snacks. Staring at the man who is at least 2 inches taller than his own 6'2" frame, George sighs. He considers feigning a headache, yet the lure of free booze and something to fill his hungry belly overrides the irritation stemming from the impromptu visit. What kind of beer? If it's a bland domestic, you've wasted a trip. Cackling laughter, full of thick phlegm, assails his ears when the man steps inside. He has a weird halting gait as he carefully picks his steps, missing the spots that creak. Tonight's a special occasion, so I sprung for dark IPA, toasted pita chips, and walnuts. George grimaces. Old dude stink. A disgusting combination of mothballs and personal body odor wafts behind him as he makes his way toward the stuffy, sparsely decorated living room. Furrowing his brow at the audacity he just waltzed inside uninvited, he tamps down his rising temper. What are we celebrating? Your newfound windfall in life trajectory, remember? Actually, I don't. We've never met. Understandable. A grieving mind takes time to reset itself, so it is no wonder you don't recall our interaction at the funeral. Name's Chester Griffin. You said to come by any time and we'd swap stories about Ms. Patrice. God rest her soul. You know, crack some cold ones while you pick my brain about recollections of her time as my neighbor and your decision to stay on for a short time while writing a book. George searches his memories for conversing with the man but draws a blank. A weird sensation flutters throughout his chest. He remembers thinking those things inside his head at the funeral while playing the part of dutiful morning son, but not speaking them out loud. He ignores the sensation, attributing the confusion to hunger and lack of sleep. Dark, heavy beer, pita chips, and walnuts are his favorite. I'm not one to turn down free beer, especially an IPA, so why not? Maybe I'll have better luck writing when slightly buzzed and my grumbling guts are full. I was just reviewing what I've written so far, and it is awful. Chester groans while easing down onto the faded floral print couch. His knees crackle and pop, and the sound makes George's skin crawl. Dust flutters in his wake, yet he appears oblivious. I like my beer in a frozen mug. Do you have one? A mug, yes. Frozen, no. The fridge is in on its last legs and the freezer quit working last week. I'll set out the snacks if you'd be so kind as to fetch the mug. I find it uncouth to drink beer straight from the bottle. Stifling the urge to roll his eyes, George nods once before heading to the kitchen, returning in seconds with a semi-clean mug. Here you go, sir. Please, call me Chester. Only if you call me George. Hiding the disgust from his expression as Chester's gnarled, dirty fingers latch around the glass, he steps over and picks up the laptop, closes it, and sets it on the small end table before reaching for a bottle. Ah, nice. This brand's the best. Chester fills the mug to the rim and the weird, vapid look returns before he takes a sip. I agree. Ms. Patrice mentioned it was her favorite as well. She certainly would have enjoyed sharing one with you before the cancer ate her insides away. Taken aback by the rude comment, George bites his lip, holding in a snarky comeback. Before the evening turns sour, he grabs a handful of walnuts and tosses them into his mouth, immediately spitting them out. Oh my, I'm sorry. I swore Ms. Patrice told me walnuts were your favorite. Perhaps I misunderstood. Near the end of her time on this plane of existence, she had trouble speaking coherent sentences because of the multiple surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation treatments to remove the tumors in her esophagus, mouth, and tongue. George's anger peaks. He doesn't need to be reminded his mother died a slow, agonizing death from esophageal carcinoma, or the fact he did not come to visit her during her last 3 months alive. Walnuts are my favorite, but something's wrong with these. They taste like moldy old dirt. Really? Chester leans forward, scoops up several in his claw-like fingers, tosses them into his mouth, frowns, yet swallows them. Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Such a shame and waste. I'll return them to the grocer and request a refund. I am so embarrassed. To remove the rancid taste, George twists off the cap and downs half the bottle. The glorious brew does its job, washing the last vestiges of curdled, perhaps rotted, walnuts from his mouth. Chester's watery brown eyes watch his every move before cutting over to the laptop. The vapid look vanishes, replaced by a curious gleam and a tinge of superiority. I saw the medical van earlier this week, removing all her hospice equipment from the living area. Did you donate her clothes and sundry items as well? Nosy bastard. Yes, the company took her clothing and toiletries, promising they would go to someone in need of such things. How thoughtful of you. Chester picks at the pita chips, crunching loudly on two. Have you decided what to do with the house? It needs extensive cosmetic repair, but it has good bones. Of course, it also sits smack dab in the middle of an area people are fleeing from rather than moving to, so getting a decent price may prove problematic. At least there is no mortgage, so whatever you sell it for will be pure profit. I accompanied Ms. Patrice to the clerk's office several months ago when she recorded the beneficiary deed. Smart woman. Saved you from having to endure the probate process. Aha! Light bulb alert. This is the real reason he came to visit. You want to buy it, don't you? Cheap, since you know it's not mortgaged. I can assure you, I have zero interest in spending funds I do not have on something I do not need, so no. Just making pleasant conversation, that's all. For your children or grandchildren, then? George presses. Nice enough thoughts, but I never married nor sired offspring. I believe we've established I am not interested in the residence, so let's move on. Tell me why you believe the horror story is lackluster. I never mentioned it was a horror story. George's eyebrows furrow. Were you spying on me earlier? No, it was simply an educated guess. You don't appear the type who writes action or romance or science fiction or westerns. Horror suits you. Taking another long pull from the bottle until swallowing the last droplet, George remains quiet, contemplating whether that was a backhanded compliment or an indirect jab at his manhood. He concludes it was a mixture of both. He grabs another beer. Perhaps I can help you create something truly scary? I have been a fan of the genre for as long as I can remember. George takes several hefty gulps, savoring the heavy malt that deliciously combines toasted caramel with hints of coffee and chocolate. The annoyance at the old man's intrusive visit and comments wanes. Maybe bouncing ideas off another person would be helpful. I think the biggest hurdle I'm facing is crafting something unique. You know, a fresh take on fright. I see how that can be quite a conundrum. Over the past centuries, what triggers horror, revulsion, and terror in the human psyche has certainly changed, especially with the creation of visual media. The days of writers exploring taboo societal issues or natural phenomenon to evoke fear through beautifully penned yet spine-tingling literary fiction are gone. Now what passes as literature and so-called entertainment offerings comprise of thrown-together boring tropes full of nothing but blood, gore, and outright snuff porn, profiting off the immense pain and torture of humans. Each new work tries to outdo the previous drivel by kicking up the disgust meter. But what gets lost in each new iteration is the art of telling a story. There is, however, a glimmer of hope about the new direction of the genre. What's that? There is no reason for the gratuitous bloodshed and violence. No theme or plot line. No reason is the plot line. Interesting perspectives. H.P. Lovecraft said the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown, but I believe the problem is twofold. Mankind understands things previously unknown, and we have been desensitized to violence thrust upon us through various mediums, and therefore, fear is irrelevant. Perhaps that is true on some levels, but historians are fond of saying genuine horror must contain a sense of evil able to be truly menacing, life-destroying, and antithetical to happiness. You are correct. With the advancement of knowledge, mankind understands the allegorical themes presented in the classical tales, but that does not negate the fact the world is still full of terrifying occurrences not fully comprehensible or controllable. Death, war, disease, poverty, natural disasters, cruel fate, maniacal dictators in control of weaponry capable of eradicating humanity come to mind. Entranced by the old man's insight, George tests a pita chip, realizes it is fine, downs a mouthful, swallows, and smiles. Very interesting. Boring tropes, that's one of my hurdles. All my research about crafting a story produced the same advice. Write what you know, and apparently, I know nothing about horror other than what I've been subjected to over the years, so I'm just regurgitating the works of others, which makes me a hack. Allow me to guess which boring trope you fell prey to. Sure. Let's see. The comatose soul wakes up only to discover they are trapped inside an apocalyptic disaster. A creepy child with uncanny otherworldly abilities whom everyone fears. The mutant human or humanoid driven by kill lust, impervious to weapons. Evil dolls capable of talking or tainted amulets or cursed trinkets. The possessive significant other who stalks without ceasing, destroying the thing he or she loved just so another cannot have them. A misunderstood scientist trying to explain the unexplainable to the masses who refuse to listen or heed his warnings and die from their lack of belief. No, I do not believe those were your chosen portal to extract a tale. You either opted for a soul-damning haunting from the spirits of the recently departed, or went with the nerd and promiscuous or weird girl who either dies from their lack of brain power or during sexual activity, or uses their skills to survive whatever horror lurks in the dark woods. Stunned by the old man's words and how on target they are, George chuckles. Option 2 is the one. The handsome yet slightly quirky virgin gamer nerd finally gets the hot promiscuous girl out on a date, and they find themselves on the run from a serial killer. Yes, you are correct. That plotline has been done ad nauseum. Chester removes a cigar and lighter from his shirt pocket. Do you mind? Do you? George nods toward a pack of Marlboro Reds on the table. Not at all. Sometimes ingesting nicotine gets the creative juices flowing. Look at us, still partaking in the same habit that ended Mrs. Patrice's life. It appears we are both believers in the adage, "It won't happen to me." Guess so. Both men light up, each enjoying their respective vices in silence. Considering your athletic physique, I am surprised a strong male overpowering you and disrupting amorous intentions in the woods before taking your life and the life of your lover frightens you. I was leaning toward a good old-fashioned ghost story. George opens another beer while laughing, slightly surprised he's enjoying the conversation. Write what you know, remember? Like all other imaginary monsters, I do not believe in ghosts, nor have I encountered one, so I have nothing to draw from. The serial killer in the woods is plausible and was the first thing that came to mind. I'm a gamer, but I've never had any trouble with finding women to bed, so the fiction part is the nerdy male virgin finally going on a date. Yet, you are still coming up short in the creativity department. Perhaps you need to focus on what scares you? George rises and tosses 2 logs into the dirty soot-filled fireplace before grabbing an old newspaper from the enormous pile left by his hoarder mother. He flicks the lighter and watches the yellow and orange flames lick across the dry wood. That's the other hurdle I cannot seem to jump. Nothing scares me. Chester lets out an incredulous gasp. Come now, George. If you want to be an artist, you must confront painful truths about yourself before expecting others to find your creative endeavors believable no matter the genre, but particularly horror. Fear is deeply interwoven into the human psyche, necessary for survival of all species, a primitive, ingrained response meant to defend against danger. Are you not afraid of what lies beyond, if anything at all? Will we cease to exist once inside the dark grave as the earth reclaims our flesh? Is death truly the end? If the law of conservation of mass is correct, and matter can be neither created nor destroyed, only capable of changing form, will we be aware of the change? And exactly what will we change into? Is there a life force inside us? A soul, if you will, that continues outside of the mortal body? Those questions were your sweet mother's greatest fears, facing the unknown, alone. No one is impervious to fear. Sorry to disappoint you. You appeared frightened when you noticed me standing on the porch. Jump scares don't count. They are instinctual actions by the body when surprised. In entertainment mediums, They are used to engage the audience and elicit a heightened sense of connection to the victim before they die. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm not impervious to fear. As you mentioned earlier, fear is an inborn genetic trait and all life possesses a form of it, but I am unimpressed by it. I already know monsters, alien ghosts, goblins, witches, vampires, werewolves, all other fictional ilk do not exist and are not lurking in the shadows, waiting to shred me to pieces and feast upon my organs while I scream in agony. I am fully aware the world isn't a safe place and death is inevitable, so why fear circumstances out of my control? Nothing I partake of or abstain from, eat, ingest, how fast I drive, how many vitamins or magic youth elixirs I gobble down will gain me 1 extra minute when my allotted time ends, whether from the ravages of time on the flesh, by the hand of another, disease, car accident, natural disaster, or hell, even by suicide. Benjamin Franklin said death and taxes are the only certainties in life, and I agree with him. So my motto is simple. Live my best life by sucking every drop of tantalizing juice from the tree of life until it runs dry. Nice speech and interesting theories, but I do not believe you. George finds the response humorous for some weird reason. Why? Chester's features harden, making his skin appear like marble. If you fear nothing, why did you allow your mother to suffer alone without being here by her side when she needed the comfort of her only child the most? That was a rhetorical question. Ms. Patrice provided the answer. You feared the emotions watching her die would evoke and being confronted with your own mortality. You were too scared to see the monster cancer, the surgeries, and the treatment turned her into. George bursts out laughing. Wow! If that's what she told you, she was way off base. The flames in the fireplace dwindle and disappear as frigid, rank air pumps out of the vents. The shabby curtains flutter in response. George curses under his breath. He'll have to shell out some of his inheritance to replace the busted heater before listing the property and contact an exterminator. Obviously, whatever vermin died isn't inside the walls. It's trapped in the ductwork. Chester clears his throat. So, what was your reason for leaving Ms. Patrice to grapple alone with the ravages of cancer and her impending death? Rising to his feet, noticing he is a bit unsteady, George grabs another beer. No reason, I just didn't. That is a bald-faced lie. The shift in tone and demeanor caused George to glance over at the old man. He looks paler, thinner, and more fragile than when he sat down, maybe because of the sudden temperature drop. Why do you care whether I had a reason or not? Wait, did you two have something going on besides being just neighbors? Is this your weird way of trying to make me feel bad for letting the cold-hearted woman who never wanted a child or all the responsibilities motherhood entails die alone? Is that what this little visit is all about? We did not have an intimate relationship. I do, however, know the intimate details of her life, including her personal struggles. But no, I am not here to shame you. After downing the entire bottle, George locks gazes with the annoying geezer. Then why are you here? I already told you, to discuss your newfound windfall and life trajectory, which is what we are doing. Currently, I'm offering my expensive knowledge to assist you in crafting a truly horrifying tale. No, that was just a ruse to segue over to shaming me. I'm impervious to that emotion, thanks to a woman who never showed me affection, never offered an encouraging word, wasn't concerned about providing food on the table, a birthday card, Christmas present, or cared about anyone except herself and the countless men she brought home. I lied earlier. I did have a reason for staying away. I fucking hated her and wanted her to suffer, alone, just like she did to me when I was little. Had I shown up, I wouldn't have been able to stop laughing at her expense. The only reason I'm here now is to take possession of the money and house, which I consider a small down payment of what she owed me for all the pain and suffering she inflicted on me. Thanks for the beer and chips. The walnuts, not so much. Time to call it a night, Chester. A car horn blares outside, followed in seconds by the chime of the doorbell. Chester doesn't appear to notice. He's too focused on staring at George, face devoid of any discernible emotion. Ah, there's the Instacart delivery, and your cue to exit without this evening getting any weirder. George bumped into the wall twice on his way to the front door. Several beers downed in quick succession on an empty stomach messed with his equilibrium. He opens the door and snatches the 2 bags off the porch. Turning left, he heads toward the kitchen and calls over his shoulder, "Lock the door behind you." No response. Salivating like a Pavlov dog at the contents, he sets the bags on the counter, grabs the bread and sandwich meat, rolls it up, and shoves half into his mouth. His throat and tongue feel thick, and his stomach does a weird flip-flop a millisecond before burning pain radiates from his neck, shooting daggers straight into his brain. The intensity makes his entire body tremble and knees buckle while choking. Spitting it out, he gapes at the hunk of partially chewed food on the floor. Several gray maggots wriggle and squirm in between the chunks of bread and meat. The disgusting sight makes him projectile vomit all over the stained linoleum. Shaking and unsteady on his feet, he makes his way to the living room since he hasn't heard a sound, which means Chester is still in the house. The last thing he needs is for the old bastard to see him weak or ill, which he would probably enjoy. "I wasn't kidding when I said the night's over. Time to go." His voice sounds odd, gravelly, as though speaking with a mouthful of rocks. Rounding the corner into the room, he stops short. "What the fuck?" Chester stands next to the hearth, but he's no longer wearing the outfit he had on before, and his head is inches away from the ceiling. A long ebony robe made from what looks like feathers covers his entire body, and a weird glow surrounds his face, making the exposed skin appear translucent. The edges of the robe flutter like wings, drawing George's attention. The old man's feet aren't touching the ground. Fury burns through George's brain. "What kind of hallucinogen did you give me? It was in the walnuts, wasn't it? I knew they tasted weird. Wait, you ate them too. So that means you put something in the ductwork. Is that why it smelled so bad earlier? I bet that's it. And you were spying on me, and that's how you knew what I was writing. When I come off this trip, I'm going to tear you apart, you low-life scum-sucking piece of shit. You did have a thing with Patrice, didn't you? Is that the reason you came here tonight? You wanted to make me pay for not being here for her? Did she ask you to torment me after her death?" Without making a sound, Chester glides over, eyes no longer watery brown. Now they are vibrant, glowing sable. "If you desire a reason, I'm here to usher in your reckoning, since the tantalizing juice from your tree of life is dry." The second the words reach George's ears, his body is shoved forward until inches away from the large mirror above the fireplace. The horrendous stench from before envelops his entire being. In the reflection is his mother's destroyed face staring at him from black, lifeless eyes. Her once thick honey-colored hair is matted, skin mottled and sunken in the spots where the tumors were removed. The mouth opens and her tongue and teeth are missing from inside the putrid hole. "I have the answers now, my son. We do not cease to exist once inside the dark grave as the earth reclaims our flesh. Death is only the beginning. Matter can be neither created nor destroyed, only capable of changing form. And I am aware of the excruciating change. There is a life force inside us that continues outside of the mortal body and pays for our mistakes in one plane of existence while trapped in another. forever. The image shifts, and now it is his face staring back, yet the damage remains. He is almost unrecognizable. The pain from earlier when in the kitchen reignites, sending sharp, deep pangs throughout his body. He tries to move away from the foulness, but is frozen in place. Suddenly, Chester is behind him, enveloping his body in the confines of the feathery robe. Tears pour down George's cheeks while recalling the title of his story. Death arrives on black wings. Oh shit. He isn't Mom's neighbor. He isn't human. I'm not hallucinating, nor have I been drugged. This is really happening. Foul hot breath grazes his ears. Chester whispers, "Did I succeed in creating something truly scary?" George nods through his tears, mentally willing himself to fight off whatever drug courses through his veins. Good. Time to take you to the next level. Petrified. With a loud whoosh of the robe, George is racked with debilitating pain, sorrow, grief, remorse, and fear as he watches his body collapse onto the floor, dead before the head smashes onto the edge of the fireplace. Loud, phlegmy cackles surround him as he is transported on black wings to what he truly does fear. What awaits him on the next plane of existence.
The rhythmic sound of Isaac Carter's respirator was all he could hear when he stepped out of his shuttle's airlock. His destination was in front of him, the gray space station known as Morpheus 4. At its end was a large cylindrical structure, which he had to guess was some kind of satellite camera. As the thrusters on his suit activated, he propelled forward. He made a signal towards the cockpit of the shuttle, which proceeded to leave. The pilot would be back in 3 hours, sooner if Isaac requested a quick extraction. As he drifted toward the airlock, he held his ID up to the scanner. Recognizing him as military personnel, it flashed green and the door opened. He floated into the decompression chamber as the large door closed behind him. The artificial gravity then engaged, and his feet hit the floor. A crackling noise came over the radio in his helmet.
Valkyrie 20 to Loki 48. Radio check. Do you copy? Over.
Said his partner, Kelly Monroe. Loki 48. Coming in clear, Valkyrie. Over.
You were briefed on your assignment, I presume? Over.
Affirmative, Valkyrie. Investigate the cause behind the radio silence from Morpheus 4 research station. Head to comms tower and contact the TYR Marines. Secure any personnel in research and neutralize possible threats. Over. He withdrew his assault rifle from his back, checking the ammunition as it folded out from its compact form.
Copy, Loki 48. Sending map of the station now. Over.
A loading bar appeared on his visor, which read data received when it had finished loading. Sure enough, an entire map of Morpheus 4 uploaded to his suit's onboard computer. Copy, Valkyrie. Commencing operation now. Going dark. Over.
Understood. Valkyrie out.
The communication shut off. It always sounded weird when Isaac compared Kelly's on-duty behavior to her off-duty behavior. She always sounded so cool-headed and professional when on duty, but off-duty she was always chipper and upbeat. She always had been since they were kids. Hell, she was like the big sister he never had. As such, both of them had been happy when she had achieved her childhood dream of being a Valkyrie. Isaac brushed those thoughts aside for now, opening the door in front of him. What greeted him was silence almost akin to the void outside. In front of him was a huge half-darkened lobby with the Gaia Inc. logo over the wall above the front desk. Said logo comprised of a half-formed Earth and the slogan, "Building Humanity's Path Back Home Since 2134. He had heard about the loss of Earth. Nobody knew what had happened, what had caused Earth to become uninhabitable. All he knew was that the people working on the so-called Project Morpheus was to help repopulate Earth. Bang-up job they're doing, he thought sardonically. Something terrible had happened, something that would jeopardize the project, possibly galactic security. The New Terra Council never would have sent someone from the Loki unit if it was anything else. As Isaac stepped through the lobby, his boots hardly making a noise, he did a double take as he caught a glimpse of a nearby vent. Something was dripping from it. Taking a few steps closer, he scanned the strangely colored substance. As expected, it was blood, but not human blood. Not anymore. No matches came up for the origin, but this fluid seemed to overwrite the genetic code of whoever the blood belonged to. This wasn't a mutation or anything accidental. No, whatever this was, it had assimilated the poor bastard's very DNA. That was when Isaac began to get afraid. He was already unnerved by the silence, but now he knew that there was something on this station. He then spied a small blood-stained holoscroll. Picking it up, he connected it to his suit to isolate the sound to the inside of his helmet, then played the latest recording. He almost jumped as the sounds of bedlam greeted him. Screams, gunfire, and the sounds of distorted voices snarling and speaking bizarre words and phrases were what permeated the audio. Then a man's voice began speaking rapidly. "This is Ryan Teague, Morpheus Force Security. If you're listening to this, get the hell off this station while you can. If this is anyone in the military or from the corporation, tell the higher-ups that the project is a complete failure. Scuttle the station. I say again, scuttle Morpheus 4 before these things can escape. They want to... Oh, shit! No! The recording was cut off as it dissolved into a ghastly two-toned screech followed by the sound of ripping flesh. Now Isaac was on full alert. He switched to safety off on his assault rifle before carefully making his way through the lobby and into a short hallway which led into a small unlit room with 2 more hallways on each side. Based on what the map said, his destination was down to the left. Switching on the light attached to his rifle, he began to do a sweep of the room, then did another double take. Slowly he refocused the light, only for it to illuminate a tall, grotesque being. Its general outline was humanoid, but its skin seemed to be made of a rippling silver liquid like mercury. Its face was almost human, but it possessed glowing purple eyes and razor-sharp teeth that extended from its gums. It stood over the body of a man clad in blue security armor, his skin showing signs of desiccation, and his face frozen in a look of abject terror. The creature's fingers had transformed into odd tendrils that seemed to have drained him of his vital fluids. It then looked up at Isaac, who stood frozen for a different reason. The shock of what he was seeing rooted him to the spot. It wheezed and panted, then spoke in a two-toned voice similar to what he had heard on the holoscroll. The creature said, "Soldier!" Its voice betrayed no emotion, merely expressing an observation. It stood taking in shallow breaths as it regarded him. Then it screeched and charged at him without warning. Reacting in shock and fear, he let off 8 rounds from his assault rifle, all of which hit the creature point blank, but not before it had reached him and swiped across his chest. It didn't pierce the armor, though, as it was on the ground before it could build the proper momentum. It shrieked and thrashed on the floor before being silenced by Isaac, removing his sidearm and firing at its form. Taking some time to calm himself down, he repeated in his head, 4, inhale, 4, exhale. Once he calmed down sufficiently, he scanned it. He noted that its blood consisted both of the poor humans that was on the ground and of the strange purple fluid he found in the lobby. With some reluctance, he continued down the hallway. It was clear that the possibility of survivors was moot. First and foremost, the Loki unit's specialty was black ops, and that was why he had his doubts about the assignment. They were never sent into an area in tactical gear that contained live civilians. So what was so important that they needed someone as cold and pragmatic as a Loki? Why not send the TYR Marines outright? Isaac brushed his thought aside and continued along the hallway indicated by the HUD's map. He could feel eyes on him. He knew that what he had just encountered couldn't have been the only of its kind, and for that reason he kept his rifle trained ahead. It took about a half hour to slowly creep down the hallway. He had needed to run. He could have cleared it in minutes, but stealth was a factor right now. A skittering came from the nearby vent. He whipped his head in that direction, then heard it on the opposite wall. Keeping his eyes open, he watched for any sudden movements, anything to suggest an ambush. Despite his vigilance, he was still surprised by his follower revealing itself. Lunging out of the vent and landing on the floor in front of him was a smaller creature that seemed to combine aspects of a human and a spider. It had a mostly human face, 8 purple humanoid eyes, and crawled on 8 arachnid legs, each of which had a small humanoid hand at the end. Before he could react, it was on him with a screech, latching onto his armor with impressive strength. Isaac could feel the claws of this monster's hands as its face revealed a mouth that had human teeth and a spider's fangs. Venom dripped from its mouth as it leaned forward. In desperation, he ran at the sterile white wall, slamming the creature into it with a sickening crunch. Letting out a brief squeal, it released him, falling on its back before he brought his boot down on it, again and again, until little remained of it besides a flattened body and glowing purple blood. Panting, he felt a slight sting on his side. From the looks of it, the creature had been able to leave a mark on him, but his suit didn't detect any venom in the wound, the HUD only saying, "Puncture detected. Administer medical nanomachines immediately." Removing the syringe from his tactical pouch, he injected the fluid near the wound, allowing the small robots to slowly close it. While they worked, he repaired the damage done to his suit using a gel containing similar machines. When he was finished, he continued down the hall, eventually reaching a door with the words "Testing Center, authorized personnel only." He cautiously opened the door and was about to activate his light, but as it turned out, he didn't need to. The laboratory was a large room, not quite as expansive as the lobby, but with enough space to hold at least 30 researchers. A strange purple light bathed the room in its unnatural glow, illuminating the horrors beneath it. There were numerous creatures, some of which were like the first, others like the arachnid, but many more were odd, disgusting combinations of different animal parts. One had 2 heads, one of which was a large reptilian and the other a human. Others seemed to have animal heads where normally they would have been arms. There were more configurations, but with each new creature, Isaac felt he would vomit. As he looked up, though, he wished that the monsters had been the worst part. All over the walls and obscuring the ceiling was a strange material that reminded him of a spider's web. Unlike a normal web, though, this one was glowing, pulsing with the same purple light filling the room. Entangled in the webs were people, probably most of the scientists working on the station. Flowing from their bodies was a strange purple energy. This energy was absorbed by small round objects that reminded him of egg sacs. As if to confirm this, one burst open, revealing a small humanoid creature similar to the first one he had killed. It saw him, then let out a shriek. All of its brethren turned their glowing eyes at him and proceeded to let out cries of aggression. The situation escalated from there. Letting off more rounds into the monsters, he killed 5, stomping on their heads for good measure. Another one of the spiders suddenly leapt onto his back and clawed into him. Letting out a cry of pain, he took on a similar strategy as with the first, ramming it against the wall. It took 2 more minutes of shooting, kicking, punching, and stomping, as well as destroying the sacks, but eventually, all of the creatures in the room lay dead in pools of purple blood. Taking time to heal himself and patch up the suit, he was about to walk into the comms, which lay just across the room. Then he heard a woman's raspy voice from the wall.
"Please, come here."
Scanning the source of the voice, he found her identification to come up as Dr. Rachel Bachman. In his briefing, Isaac had been told that she was the one in charge of the project. As such, she was a high-priority extraction target, or failing that, the research she had done. As he approached her, she extended an arm. In her shaking hand was a holoscroll.
"All the data you need is on there. But play the last recording and follow the instructions quickly. Go into the comms room. Then when you finish, get off the station quickly. Please, undo it. Undo.
Isaac had just enough time to grab the holoscroll as her arm went limp. To say he was confused was an understatement. Nonetheless, he plugged his suit's HUD into the device, anticipating more sounds of chaos. Instead, there was a video file of the same woman with several other files labeled differently. He selected the video. Dr. Bachman was surrounded by her colleagues, who were all running about, checking various devices and equipment, some even apprehensively grasping firearms. She looked tired, her hair messy and her eyes red, though whether from insomnia or from tears, he wasn't sure.
"Hello,
She greeted the interviewer, her voice melancholy.
my name is Dr. Rachel Bachman. I'm the head of Project Morpheus. We were sent here ostensibly to observe the Earth and to see if it could be repopulated. Our true reasons were to study these."
A hologram of one of the creatures appeared beside her.
"We have come to know these creatures as Draugr. They are the creations of something much greater, something strong enough to cause the event we have since called Ragnarok."
A still image of the infamous pit which had supposedly resulted in Earth's population dying out flashed next to her. This version was different, however. Tendrils of familiar purple light shimmered from it, seeming to reach for the station and separating into numerous vein-like offshoots.
"In that pit lives the Jormungandr. This is the closest image I can show, but I will tell you what you need to know about it, to the best of my ability. It possesses vast telepathic abilities, which are shown by the purple energy. You can't see it with the naked eye unless viewed through our equipment or exposed to the creature. It made the Draugr. Well, perhaps made is the wrong word. During Ragnarok, it took any creature living on Earth, including humans, and assimilated them into itself. After that, it began combining them. We don't know why, but our studies have suggested that it isn't content to merely tear apart and reconstruct organisms. It wants to create life of its own. To that end, the Jormungandr began assimilating the genetic code of the aforementioned creatures, hoping to gain a better understanding of how to create something. Its grasp of scientific knowledge was rudimentary at best before we came here. Because of us, it's becoming more knowledgeable, learning how to combine more efficiently, and producing organisms that live longer. It wants to recreate us in its image. After that, we have reason to assume that it will hunt down the colonies of humans, then assimilate them as well, or perhaps just annihilate them. We still aren't certain.
A trickle of blood ran from her left nostril. Then she winced and clutched her head.
I need to speak quicker. I've been able to block it out, but it's becoming more persistent. The Draugr have broken containment on the station and have begun taking the genetic material of the humans and other creatures on board. The Jormungandr wants to spread its influence using them. Using us. In the comms room, there is a console that will activate a secret component of the station. One we've been able to develop after studying the Jormungandr for long enough.
A diagram of the said console and the component appeared beside her.
We had it imported from a discontinued planet mining station. It was discontinued because of its unfailing tendency to irreparably damage the planet it was fired upon. We call it the Mjolnir. With the proper tests and modifications, we've been able to make it strong enough to...
Here, tears began running from her eyes as she resumed talking.
It's strong enough to harm the Jormungandr, but that isn't enough. Life on Earth is still present. The two exist symbiotically. Simply put, you need to destroy life on Earth. I know this seems mad to you, and it is. I hate this as much as you do, stranger, but whoever you are, this is the only way to ensure that the Jormungandr's power is kept in check. There's no guarantee of it dying, but the Draugr will die, and more importantly, we on the station will. The entire team is in agreement. We cannot be allowed off the station alive, but we can't activate it. The Jormungandr won't let us. You aren't its thrall. You haven't been exposed to it long enough. I'm sorry to force this on you. More than that, though, I'm sorry I ever began this project. If you happen to see my family, tell them...
Here she stifled a sob, then continued in a broken voice.
Tell them the truth, and that I love them. Good luck.
Just before the recording ended, the door burst open, and the sounds of the Draugr rang out, along with the sounds of gunshots. Isaac stood for a moment, processing all this information. He looked towards the open door, heading for the comms room. Walking towards it, his rifle still aimed ahead, he tried to concentrate on the mission. Once he reached the room, however, he felt it, heard it. He felt thoughts that weren't his own running through his brain as he found the console she had mentioned. Sure enough, he recognized it as a mining cannon interface. They had been developed for the layperson to operate, due to the interchangeable nature of mining jobs. He paused before he could activate it. Was he really going to go through with this? He was trained in the ways of unconventional warfare, guerrilla tactics, infiltration of crime syndicates and terrorist cells, murder. The Loki unit specialized in all of these and more, but this was far out of his league. He was told to destroy the Earth, the cradle of humankind. He then remembered what he had been taught during his training. He was told that he would be called upon to do things that would make him sick, things that no decent human being could ever do with a clear conscience. He was taught that no matter what, he had to keep humanity in mind. Ragnarok had forced humans to rebuild civilization all over again on new planets, make first contact with intelligent alien life the hard way, and engage in 3 civil wars during the first 30 years. If it hadn't been for Ragnarok, the Lokis wouldn't exist, nor would they be needed. And now he was discovering that Ragnarok had not been some freak of nature, that something living, something intelligent had caused it, and it was planning to finish what it started. 4. His mind was made up. Humanity had endured its near extinction, and he wouldn't let that be in vain. He activated the console and was met with the pit. Suddenly millions of purple lights shone from it. No, he realized, horror forming a knot in his stomach. Their eyes. As the eyes shone brightly back at their new voyeur, the light from them revealed the beast itself. Jormungandr was the world serpent according to Norse mythology. This, however, bore no resemblance to a serpent. It didn't resemble anything that Isaac had a frame of reference for. Natural laws didn't seem to apply to it. It moved in ways that Isaac dared not try to make sense of, lest he drive himself mad. Then it spoke, and he recognized it as the voice of the intrusive thoughts he had felt and heard when he entered. Seeming to grip his mind, spoke of being older than the earth, that the earth had been built for it. It hadn't been built as a home, though, but as a prison, a cage. Who had built the cage, the Jormungandr didn't say, only referring to them as they in a hateful, venomous tone. It then began to coaxingly speak to Isaac. It told him that it hadn't intended to begin Ragnarok, but that it was willing to make amends by allowing humankind to join it, to become one with it. No more would there be any conflict, any hate. Isaac began to respond mentally, agreeing with it. Sounding pleased with his reply, it told him to contact the Marines per his original instructions. It guided him to walk to the communication equipment. Then it released his mind. The instant it did this, he connected to the console, sending an emergency code to his pilot. The voice returned, sounding puzzled, then horrified and angry, as he ran back to the cannon console. Placing the targeting reticle over the massive eyes, he hit the button on the screen that would fire it. Sure enough, a long energy beam shot out from the device he had mistaken for a camera. Pain. Pain lanced through his head as he felt both the creature being impacted by the cannon and hearing its agonized shrieks. It was all he could do to gather himself up and begin to sprint back the way he had come, feeling the voice of the Jormungandr growing quieter and weaker. The station's machinery began sparking and exploding as the cannon had overloaded them. More Draugr, in a pain-desperate frenzy, tried to stop him, but he just gunned them down. It took much quicker to leave the station than it did to enter, due to his stealthy approach. Eventually, he found himself back in the lobby, where he quickly opened the door just as more Draugr charged at him. He closed it once inside the decompression chamber, then opened the airlock door. Sure enough, the shuttle was there, waiting for him. He propelled himself toward the entrance to the vessel, then collapsed once inside. Breathing heavily, he slowly got up, sat in a chair, and gazed at the station. As the shuttle departed, he watched as it began to dissolve into a ball of metal and flames. Then he looked past it. Slowly, the flame was spreading across the earth from the pit, looking almost like some kind of flower opening. The irony didn't escape him. He leaned back, sighing heavily. Short as this op had been, this was hands down the most stressful. He looked at the holoscroll in his hand, then tucked it away in his tactical pouch. No doubt the new Terra Council would want to hear about this. He had just annihilated Earth, rendering it truly uninhabitable. He might be excommunicated from the Lokis, possibly executed for all he knew. He didn't care. Even as he heard the withered, faint voice in his head cursing his name, he knew he had made the best decision under the circumstances. The Jormungandr was still alive, but now it could never gain the power it had wanted. One problem remained, however. The Jormungandr had spoken of beings that had imprisoned it. As he gazed out at the void of space, he wondered where those creatures were now.
It ain't always easy, but sometimes a guy's just gotta do what he knows is right. When you lie awake in the middle of the night, pondering the consequences of your actions, wondering if you're too small to make a difference anyway, you gotta remind yourself what's important in this world. We need to look out for each other. Protect the ones who can't protect themselves. That's why I decided to kill the man in the floppy brown hat. The man who liked to watch children. I can't recall the exact moment when I first saw him. It seemed as if he'd always been there, sitting like a tired old vulture at his favorite table next to the playground at the south end of the park. At first glance, he was just another harmless old geezer. Hard to tell, though, what's inside a man by the clothes he wears. You can't just look at the color of a person's eyes or the shape of his nose and know all the things he's done that he'd rather keep secret from the rest of the world. Look at me, arms covered in jailhouse tattoos, hair halfway down my back. People assume things based on appearances and first impressions. Usually they're wrong. The man who watched children had golden skin that looked like it would be hard to the touch, like leather. I often wondered if he might have been a farmer in another life. He could have been as old as 80 or as young as 65, but I was sure he had at least 30 years on me. He was stooped and frail, his skin speckled with liver spots. Every day he wore a wrinkled flannel shirt, baggy trousers, and that floppy brown fisherman's hat pulled down low on his head. You could never quite see his eyes. I assumed that was on purpose. Since his eyes were never visible, most folks must have assumed he was sleeping, dozing like old farts do as life goes on around them. Before long, I knew better. He just sat there, silent, still. The only time I saw him move at all was when he was coming or going, or when he occasionally rubbed one bony finger at a cancerous-looking spot on the side of his nose. He always sat in the same place, on the edge of the playground at the picnic table halfway between the restrooms and the monkey bars, the one with the I Love David W. carved into the bench, which I kept meaning to paint over, but I never got around to it. Day in and day out, he watched the children. Leaned back, arms crossed. Sometimes I would see him smiling, as if at some obscene joke only he could hear. But usually not. Mostly he just watched them. It wasn't right. It was sick. I decided something had to be done. After the first time I noticed the old man, I saw him sitting there every day for at least a month. Like a word you never heard before that pops up everywhere once you become aware of its existence. He was there on weekends, even on holidays. Before long, I realized he was as reliable as the break of dawn. Only once did I not see him, and I remember I was almost disappointed. For a period of about 72 hours, he did not show. I know because by then I had started keeping track in a little notebook I carry in one pocket of my coveralls. It was during the last few days of February. A cold snap had struck our city that week, and the kids were all at home building snowmen, having snowball fights, or whatever kids do to celebrate a day when school's been called off. I shoveled snow from the sidewalks before heading home around noon each day, celebrating in my own way by drinking a beer or two while I thought hard about the old man. I wondered what he did with his free time. How did he occupy himself when there were no kids to watch? I pondered the dark things he surely got up to there in his apartment. Yes, just as he watched the children, I had been watching him, and by that point I knew he lived in the apartment building across the street from the park. and such thoughts nauseated me for those 3 days when I did not see him. Once the 9 inches of snow that had fallen on our city was nothing more than ugly gray slush piled against every curb, the children returned to the park. So did the old man. Once again, he became another permanent fixture of the park, like the water fountains or the dented signs along the walking trails that everyone ignored. No bikes or skateboards, please clean up after your pets. Or that weird metal sculpture thing near the bandstand that I always thought looked like a giant butthole. As always, I was the only one who noticed him, sitting with his floppy brown hat pulled low, his hands clasped in his lap. I knew what he was up to. He didn't fool me for a second. In prison, they would have called him Short Eyes. It would have lasted a week if he was lucky, before another inmate stuck a sharpened toothbrush handle into the bastard's heart. By now, you've hopefully figured out what the hell I was doing hanging around the playground every day. I wasn't like him. You can get that shit out of your head. I was there 6 days a week, 9 hours a day, because it was my job. For the past 3 years, I've been employed by the City Parks Department. I'm the guy you see walking around in the dark green coveralls, the one who empties the trash, mops the bathroom floors, scrapes the gum off the benches. Or maybe you don't see me. You're not supposed to, I guess. I like that just fine. I prefer to go through life unnoticed. It's easier that way. I don't know when the idea first came to me. One day, I simply realized I had no choice. I thought about calling the cops, telling them my suspicions about the old man at the playground. I thought about that for maybe 3 seconds. But I decided against it because I knew they would think I was crazy. The old man was like a monster out of one of those old body snatcher movies. You couldn't see what he really was. He looked like everyone else. No one ever believed the good guys until it was too late. It was all on me to set things right. I did it on Saturday, shortly after 4 in the afternoon. The park was loud, and the playground filled with the squeals of children dangling from the monkey bars and climbing on the jungle gym. A group of young mothers stood off to one side, their chatter reminding me of some alien language only they could understand. They were all so oblivious. How could they not see what was going on right in front of them? They carried on about their husbands' promotions and what they planned to cook for dinner and who some bimbo had hooked up with on some stupid reality show while he sat there watching their children and thinking about what he would like to do to them. As I did my rounds, I remember feeling as if my whole body was dripping with sweat beneath my City Parks Department coveralls. Normally, my nose scrunched up as I emptied the garbage cans, smelling the leftovers of people's unfinished lunches and the stench of soiled diapers. But this time, I barely noticed it. I took my time doing my rounds, all the while keeping an eye on the old man. When a little boy's ball bounced out of the playground area and rolled to the bastard's feet, I knew today was the day. He bent to retrieve the ball, and when he handed it back to the boy, I saw one long, claw-like finger stroke the back of the toddler's hand. It made me think of a spider scampering after an insect that had flown into its web. The old man said something to the little boy that I couldn't hear. The kid smiled uneasily at him before running back to his friends. I clenched my teeth so hard they squeaked in my skull. I could wait no longer. First things first, I had to get him alone. In the men's restroom, perhaps? No, I had never seen him go in there. For all I knew, the son of a bitch had a colostomy bag hidden inside his baggy pants, did his business there, without ever having to leave his perfect place beside the playground. I decided I would have to follow him back to his home. Yes, I would do it there. It was the only way the crime couldn't be traced back to me. I had to be careful. I wished I had worked it all out beforehand in my notebook. Too late to worry about that now. When he left, which was usually around the same time I finished my shift, I would do it. I continued with my work, and about an hour later something happened that I couldn't help thinking was a gift from God. How could it be anything other than a sign from the man upstairs that I was doing the right thing? A group of fat black clouds appeared above the park. One moment the day was sunny and warm, and the next thunder rumbled overhead. The weatherman hadn't even called for rain that day. If I hadn't known it before, I knew now. I was meant to do this. A skinny, bald man ran past me toward the parking lot, pulled along by a panting golden retriever on a leash. A trio of spiky-haired teenagers rolled by on skateboards, the smell of cigarettes and marijuana trailing behind them. Mothers scrambled to gather their things, ushered their children into station wagons and minivans as the bottom fell out of the sky, and huge drops of rain plinked and plunked upon the monkey bars at the jungle gym, like the voice of the playground itself telling me to do it, do it, do it, do it. From my vantage point near the ladies' bathroom, I watched the old man get up to leave. His hat was already growing soggy in the downpour, but he didn't take it off. He never took it off. I had been changing out the bag in a garbage can when it started to rain. I left the full bag sitting on the ground, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and quickly closed the distance between us. I was alone with him. The last 3 or 4 minivans exited the park as the rain fell harder. Only the man who liked to watch children straggled behind. I heard him cough once as he left the playground. He walked slowly, hunched over. I followed him across the street to an old apartment building. I never had a clue that I was behind him. I followed him up to the 2nd floor. He was stronger than he looked. He didn't even use the elevator. He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, fumbled for his keys. The door had a crooked brass number on it. 12. I wondered if that was his favorite age, or perhaps a cutoff point. I reached into my coveralls, pulled out my hunting knife, and stuck its point against his spine. He gasped. I warned him not to make another sound. We stepped into his apartment, and I closed the door behind us.
"What do you want?" he said. "I don't have any money."
"I don't want your money." His wrinkled hands trembled. I looked down at my own hands, noticed they were shaking too, maybe even worse than his. I took a deep breath, gripped the knife tighter. The old man's hat flopped low over his face, like a dead animal lying on top of his head, rainwater dripping from its brim onto the carpet. For the first time, I got a really good look at him. He stared at me with watery blue eyes. His lower lip quivered, making me think of an earthworm shriveling up on the sidewalk after a summer storm. He looked a lot like my favorite uncle, who had died while I was in prison. For the briefest moments, I found myself wondering if I was doing the right thing. He looked so frail, just a terrified old man. I cursed beneath my breath and pushed all doubt from my mind. I forced myself to focus on the truth of what he was. He was a tumor infecting this world. He had to be cut out. The rain battered at a nearby window like the souls of dead children, begging to come inside.
What do you want from me?
He said. His breathing was heavy, ragged. I wondered if he might die of a heart attack right in front of me, saving me the trouble.
I don't have much. My social security checks are barely enough for...
I already told you I don't want your money, I said. This isn't about that.
Please, just tell me what you want.
You like to watch them, don't you? Freak. He blinked. His mouth hung open, showing his wet gray dentures. Something clicked in the back of his throat. He couldn't believe I was on to him, that he'd been found out. I said, I won't let you hurt them. Thunder boomed. Lightning flickered through the window as if someone was snapping pictures of our awkward confrontation. The old man stared at the knife in my hand. I glanced around his apartment. It was small, sparsely furnished, the kind of home that instantly identified its owner as a man who had lived alone for many years. The place smelled like beef stew and cheap cologne. I tasted bile on the back of my throat. Thought I might throw up. There were pictures of children all over, a dozen of them at least, hanging crookedly on the walls, in dusty frames atop the TV, and on a corner table next to an old rotary phone. Twin boys in matching baseball uniforms, a freckle-faced tyke dressed like a snaggletooth Dracula, a little girl with Down syndrome, cuddling a puppy, a teenager in a ballerina outfit with a long braided ponytail, a red-faced infant in the arms of a plump young mother. They might have been his grandchildren. Perhaps some of them were his great-grandchildren. That did occur to me. But when I started stabbing him, I couldn't stop. I plunged the knife into his belly over and over until my arm grew sore and his midsection was reduced to a sticky mush, like jabbing a spoon again and again into a jar of strawberry jam. He died sooner than I expected. Before I realized the extent of what I had done, he was crumpled at my feet like an old doll with its stuffing ripped out. His blood was everywhere, saturating his living room carpet, spattered across his walls and furniture, dripping from the knife in my hand, coating my wrist like a sticky glove. Eventually, my heartbeat slowed. My breathing returned to normal. I knew I had done the right thing. I would be lying if I told you I wasn't worried. I didn't want to go back to prison, but I had done a good job of cleaning up after myself. First things first, I burned my bloody coveralls. It's what I do. I clean up after people, day after day, so of course I know how to take care of my own mess. After a few months, the cops stopped looking for the old man's killer. Without any leads, their case went nowhere. Before long, the paper stopped talking about his murder, and another hot story took its place. What comes next? I didn't realize it until after talk of the pervert's murder settled down, but I know now what I have to do. Everybody's good at something. And my something isn't just picking up litter or painting over graffiti 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. The hard part is deciding who should be next. I've been keeping track of the possibilities in my notebook, and my notebook is nearly full. Maybe it'll be this punk I've seen lurking around the park. He wears a pair of expensive-looking binoculars around his neck, pretends he's into bird watching. But I know better. I've seen the way he stares at the teenage girls jogging by in their short shorts and their halter tops. I've seen how he adjusts himself through his baggy pants once their backs are to him. I saw a man in the mall the other day, this piece of crap who swatted his daughter's butt when she wouldn't stop crying. She could have been no older than 4 or 5, and though he didn't hit her very hard, I could see a desperate plea for help when the child's bright blue eyes met my own. Then there's the woman in the apartment adjacent to mine, the one with a ring in her nose and the pro-choice sticker on her Toyota. I heard she works at the clinic down the block. She helps slaughter babies for a living. It ain't always easy, but sometimes a guy is just gonna do what he knows is right. When you lie awake in the middle of the night, pondering the consequences of your actions, wondering if you're too small to make a difference anyway, you gotta remind yourself what's important in this world. We need to look out for each other. Protect the ones who can't protect themselves. This is my duty.
Fact. According to the Insurance Information Institute, there's a 1 in 116th chance that you, taking your car out for a drive, will crash into a deer. Those odds increase drastically during the fall and winter months, during the white-tailed deer's mating season, known colloquially as the rut. 1.5 million deer-related insurance claims per year. 147 deaths per year on average. You're probably wondering when and why I became such an expert on this topic. Well, what else could I do in spite of it happening to me? When something catastrophic and novel like that occurs, one of your next moves is to research the hell out of it. Inform yourself of your plight. Try and fool yourself into some kind of understanding or acceptance to deaden the nagging, incredulous agony in your head. The one that constantly forces you to ask yourself 2 damning words. Why me? I may have been dozing off. My headlights might have been dim. Perhaps I was distracted by some weird piece of debris on my windshield. Regardless, all I can recall was something, large and vaguely animal, rushing into my field of view. There was a muffled crash, a skull-rattling shatter. Everything went blurry and red, followed by the sounds of a dying engine and a dislodged front panel dragging against the road. I limped my spent car to the shoulder and staggered out the door. I blinked against the darkness, the night air thick with blood and gasoline. My vision adjusted to the bountiful shafts of moonlight, and I saw it sprawled in the middle of the road, a mangled pile of hide and protruding bone. Tranced, I almost didn't see the other car, a pair of angry, glowing eyes that swerved and honked past us, lashing me with a whip of cold air. It was only then I comprehended that the front end of my car had crumpled in on itself like a soda can, and that I was in dire need of a tow truck and a cup of coffee. In retrospect, an incident like that gets under your skin in a more detached, impersonal manner, I feel. I'd been in 3 accidents in my life. A hydroplane totaled my old car, some idiot who sideswept me because I was in their blind spot. Those 2 at least had circumstances behind them. Human error, lack of foresight, easy solutions to avoidable problems. Despite the grief they incurred, I at least know why they happened. There were reasons why. Now the stag didn't know any better. I couldn't know any better. Its brain was hopped up on sex hormones, preoccupied with screwing every doe from Duluth to DeLonga, and in precisely the right place at precisely the right time, its lustful quest drove it into the road where I drove into it. Without a car to commute with, my time working from home gave me time to fulminate over my misfortune. I dwelled on the matter for hours, days even, yet I could only arrive at the conclusion that it just happened. That it's what nature intended. No circumstances, no reason. It just was. I guess that's helping me cope with the other thing that happened to me. Ironically, it also involved deer. With the crash, I hated that animal, and every breath it took down to its last. The frantic phone calls, incomprehensible insurance agents, and rampant deductibles were a testament to that. With this, well, again, I find myself wishing they'd have died, for their own sake. Working from home also presented ample opportunities to explore other activities. One of them was walking. At the office, the greatest amount of walking I did was across the street to grab a sandwich for lunch. With additional downtime, I took to exploring my neighborhood for the first time in a long while. Living on the outskirts of a national park, deer were never a foreign sight to me. At least once a month in the dark, early morning hours, I'd see one or two trotting across the road in search of fresh gardens to devour. Mostly does. From what I've heard, the bucks tend to be secretive and stick to the depths of the forest. With the rut, that number increased to roughly 2 per week, including evenings, when I usually went out on my walks. That's when the bucks became more frequent. When the sun sets and darkness swallows the earth, even the most familiar of places can turn into an alien landscape. Normally, my days end at 6 in the evening, and I spend the rest of my nights grounded in the house. But with the lessened daylight hours and the chilly air, I felt an invigoration during my nighttime walks I hadn't felt in years. The coldness was like little nipping jaws on the bridge of my nose, bracing daggers in my throat and lungs. The streetlights alternated orange and white, and my shadow crept and warped down the street as I passed underneath them. The skies were schizophrenic in their variety. I saw marbled gray clouds, wispy tentacles of vapor, a veritable blanket of black, and sometimes unbelievable clarity. So many stars I may have been looking at particles of sand on a cosmic beach. Those times I saw deer were always in the streetlights, majestic silhouettes that just sort of appeared from the gloom, only to vanish again on the other side of the beam. Sometimes they saw me, swiveling their shadowy heads over to me, their antlers like jagged pagan crowns. We would stare for a moment, and then, with a flick of its tail, it would gallop away, its hooves making no sound on the asphalt. In those cold, lonesome moments, inexplicable thoughts crossed my mind. I wondered where exactly they'd gone off to. What if I were to forget about my walk, my work, my life for a night, and just follow one of those wandering bucks into the void? The question lingered in me like grubs in dead wood throughout the day of the autumn months. Then, one cold December night, a Friday, I took my chance. I don't know if I heard him or not, but something compelled me to turn around, just in time to see him emerge under the light. He was an impressive specimen, a 12-pointer if I remember correctly. His winter coat had grown out in full, adding a layer of tawny shag to his figure. I stared at him, an invisible pull tugging in his direction. I looked around. All the lights in the surrounding houses were off. The moon was so intense it could have been early morning, and the buck was moving away. I made my choice. Readying myself, I followed him. I kept my distance, knowing that one wrong move would alert him to my presence, and he'd lose me in the undergrowth. The buck ambled up a hill between two houses. I picked up the pace, the sounds of air conditioning units drowning out my footsteps. Thankfully, the backyard wasn't fenced in, and after a quick scope, I slept across the lawn and was not too far behind the buck when I entered the forest. Intuition told me the buck was probably looking for food or a receptive doe, but I didn't care where it would take me. Even before the crash, my life wasn't terribly exciting. Something as simple and aimless as following a deer was the most daring thing I'd done since my teenage years. And even back then, I wasn't exactly what one would call a wild child. I felt a tense giddiness within me. I wasn't supposed to be doing this, but I didn't care. I more than welcomed it. I embraced it. The trees were thin in this part of the woods, so I was able to stay out of sight and keep an eye on the buck. After a few minutes, it emerged into a new backyard. I stopped. I wasn't as close to the heart of the forest as I suspected. After assessing its surroundings, the buck lowered its head and began uprooting a bed of petunias. I sighed, realizing suddenly how stupid this all was. I was in sight of someone's house. If they had a sharp eye and enough of an inclination, they'd see my face standing out in the brush like a flashlight. I took one last look at the buck, then turned around and began picking my way back between the trees. Several things happened at once. A metallic crash from the side of the house, the scurrying of feet, the deep booming bark of a dog, and I saw the canine tear from a doghouse and across the yard. The buck, startled, jumping in the air, and bolted to the right, back into the forest. I could see its gracile form flitting between the trees. In a bout of recklessness, I dismissed my pledge to turn back and followed it back in. After a moment of breakneck running, it came to a stop and threw its head back over its haunches. I could still hear the dog going berserk in the distance. Hidden behind a tree, I reflected on the noise I'd heard. It was most likely a trash can, knocked over by a raccoon or a coyote. Whatever it was of prime interest to the dog, who continued barking its head off. Then, whatever it was, silenced the dog as it gave a last high-pitched yelp. The resulting silence that followed was more chilling than the late-night air. Even the buck seemed dumbstruck, having gone completely still, save for a nervous twitching of its ears. I stewed in my dark corner. Was it a coyote? Wolves weren't found this far east, and bears, well, they're astronomically rare. Maybe its owner had only come out with a physical reprimand. Whatever the case, I wasn't going to turn back and find out now. As if overcome with a new directive, the deer swiveled its neck forward and trotted off. I didn't want to resume immediately. The option to give up and go home never seemed more inviting. "Stop it," a voice in my head urged. "Follow this through until the end." I still don't know whether or not I should have listened. As I followed, I realized that I was making more noise than normal, yet the buck seemed not to notice or care. Instead, it stopped again, brought its snout to the ground, then reared its head up, its lips curling back in a bizarre sneer. I watched this ritual with subdued fascination. It snapped back to attention and galloped off, and I broke into a full run. Weaving through the trees, I realized what it must have been, with a smirk. Only one thing could drive a male so mindlessly dogged like that. The ground below us began to slope downward, and while I had to step carefully among the rocks, the buck simply seemed to glide from one uneven outcropping to the next, like a phantom in the moonlight. I could tell now we were definitely in the heart of the forest. The shrubs and thorns at waist level were overgrown and grabbed at my clothes. If the buck couldn't hear my manic swiping and crashing then, I knew I was definitely in the clear to catch up, however noisily I wanted to. There must have been some seriously prime tail wherever it was going. The ground leveled out again, then after a brief pursuit through a patch of young growth, I heard the sound of rushing water. Was it only looking for a drink? Then the trees gave way entirely, and the pit lay before us. It was a stony gulch, like an empty swimming pool in the middle of the forest, that stretched out of sight. Its bottom was jagged with boulders. A circular drainage pipe wide enough for me to walk upright through emptied a weak stream of water into the ravine. I stopped, bewildered, but the buck went right down into the pit. My stomach gave a lurch at what I saw within it. There was a single doe, lying down, its spindly legs tucked underneath it. As I breathed in, I recoiled at a sharp, musky, ammonic odor. Without having smelled anything like it before, I knew exactly what it was. I was surprised every buck in the state hadn't converged on this one spot to this one doe. As the buck approached, the doe's wet black eyes flashed with fear, the moon reflected in her vacuous pupils. He circled her, nuzzling her flanks, giving affectionate jabs with his antlers. She tried shifting away, but she seemed hesitant to get up, as if injured or weak. The buck became insistent, shoving at her hindquarters. The doe emitted a squeal, trying to reach back and snap at him. She wasn't having any of it. It was only when the buck tried lowering himself onto her that she rose shakily and scurried away from him. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the moonlight. The harder I gazed, the more my body seemed to forcefully reject what I was seeing. Yet there it was, solidly, undeniably there. Something was clinging to the doe's stomach, swaying like a pendulum from her movement. I let out something between a gag and a gasp when she turned in my direction. Reaching up from her underside and clasping her side was a human arm. Someone was attached to her underside. The buck must have seen it too, or heard me. Regardless, it whipped around and tried to run. But a sharp whistle cut through the air, and the buck shrieked, rearing up, and then dropped like a bag of bricks to the ground, with a crunch. Amid the regal tangle of its antlers, something ivory and spear-like protruded from the buck's eye. What sickened me most from the spectacle is how the thing underneath the doe merely shifted its grasp, and its host lay back down to resume its laden vigil. From deep within the drainage pipe came the sound of whispers and dragging feet. I didn't want to see whatever was going to happen. No one would have. But I felt like I'd lost an old friend, and I had to see his fate through to the end, no matter how horrible that end might be. The entrance to the pipe blazed with orange torchlight. The sounds from within almost seemed to pour out, echoing and reverberating. I ducked lower behind the edge of the gulch. People emerged from the drainage pipe. Grotesque, deformed people. Stunted, completely naked, pale as the moon, hairless, with warped ape-like countenances. Like stalking lizards, they crawled among the rocks, their moist skin like glistening embers in the glow of their torches. I could tell they weren't normal people. Some kind of subspecies, a lost hominid. Terror and fascination kept me glued to the spot. The men, distinguishable from their shriveled endowments, surrounded the dead buck like wild hogs, butchering it with blades, unwrapping it like a Christmas present. Complete deconstruction in seconds. The more nubile of the group gathered around the doe. I found myself more drawn to her with horror. They clustered by her head, and one of them held out what resembled a small, shallow basin. The others dipped their fingertips in the basin and seemed to anoint the doe, streaking a liquid across her snout under her chin. The fresh smell of deer piss hit me, and as I reeled from the odor, the doe stood again, and a creature scooped up the thing hanging off its stomach. I nearly fainted from the sight. It was an infant, one of their own, its chin dribbling with milk, and it let out a cry that was matched by the low, garbled wails of the matrons. Transfixed, I didn't notice that the males had finished their work on the buck and had diverted their attention to me. Something whistled past my ear and stuck in the tree behind me. I jumped reflexively to my feet, and I was suddenly in full view of the coven. The pit exploded with their unearthly shrieks, and as the females among them scattered for cover, the males stiffened and held out their arms in an aiming formation. They seemed to drag the knuckles of their other hands up the arms from their wrist. There was a collective snap like a bowstring, and I ducked again, and the air above me rained with pearly white projectiles that again stuck to the trees behind me. I got up and pivoted to run before they could reload again, but once again I stopped at what I saw. The trees, freshly splintered, with what looked like arrows of bone, were marked with deep scratches of archaic symbols, circles and swirls and gouges. The weight of the revelation held me in place. This was their patch, their feeding ground, and I was the intruder there. That split second of frozen dread nearly cost me. I could feel the back of my leg split open and jam in place, locked by a penetrating shaft below the underside of my knee. The pain wasn't intense at first, but the sudden lack of motion and the ghostly sensation of a foreign body inside my skin caused my blood to spike, lungs to seize. Spasming with panic, I lurched into the woods away from their line of fire, but with the downward slope and one crippled leg gaining uphill traction was a lost cause. Instead, I found myself drifting slightly downward, back down toward the gulch. I lost my footing. My legs stiffened entirely, and I keeled over and hit the ground with a breathtaking crash. The angle carried me downhill, my elbows and sides caromed off protruding rocks, and my clothes tangled in brambles. The world was a dark, spinning, light-headed blur for a moment that felt like years, and suddenly I came to a stop in a cold, muddy puddle. Bruised, flaring, my mouth flooded with the taste of sludge, I pushed myself up and stumbled incoherently among the boulders. I glanced up, and as my vision swam back into place, I realized I was essentially in a giant bowl. Only one way to go, through the pit. In the distance, behind a bend in the gorge, I could hear frantic shrieks and tumbling rocks. They hadn't known I'd fallen back into their hole. I took what I knew to be my one last chance and ran. It was an absurdist endeavor, hopping on my one good leg, sparing only precious half seconds to balance myself on the other, which sent wooden jabs of pain up my body with each heaving motion. I prayed the sounds of their own manic scrambling would drown out my constant kicking of pebbles, splashing of puddles, and ragged, horrified breathing. I rounded another bend and saw light flickering in the clearing. I staggered towards it, my heart elating, then blackening as I got closer. It was a crudely assembled campfire, a smoking spit of organs roasting over it, surrounded by spikes topped by the shadowy, decomposing heads of bucks. I had escaped their hunting ground straight to their nest. In the firelight were run-down bungalows made of sticks and dried mud. Over the crackling flames I heard rustling from within them. Like worms crawling from soil, pallid pygmies emerged from the bungalows and laid their beady black eyes on me. They shrieked in alarm. In my blind frenzy, I barreled towards them, and they retreated into their shelters. I would have slipped past them into the woods beyond if my damn leg hadn't given out. I fell and crashed into one of the bungalows, taking it down at its foundations. A creature inside burst from a collapsed pile of sticks and bolted past the fire with a screech, like a wailing wraith in the night. I scrambled away as more creatures shifted from underneath the rubble, finally latching onto a low-hanging branch and dragging myself back up. The rubble fell away entirely, and the image within burned everything else I'd seen that night out of my mind. 2 other creatures were there, one spread out on the ground, her belly swollen with child, one overseeing her, who snarled and bared her gray teeth at me, and next to them, curled tight into a ball, a doe. She seemed catatonic, unaware of the chaos around her. Her engorged udder jutted from her stomach. I could see veins snaking underneath its thin skin. I never even knew deer had udders. Paralyzed, I felt a warm liquid caking my side and smelled the odor of deer piss again. Backing away into the cover of the trees, I offhandedly wondered if a gang of horny bucks would descend on me as well as a coven of enraged pygmies. Torchlight bloomed in the distant darkness. Once more I turned and ran, but there was another sudden drop, and I plunged down into a shallow cliff of a creek. I went under, and the frigid water engulfed me, seizing the breath from me, but with one last shred of thought, I undid my coat and took it off like old skin, finally breaking the surface, letting the current take me away from the deformed, unspeakable horrors festering in the pit. The current carried me to a bridge overlooking a rocky shore, and I clambered up great chunks of granite to the side of the road. The remnants of my clothes felt stuck to my skin. My blood was slush in my veins. My muscles were icy with agony. With the moonlight whitening my complexion, I was indistinguishable from a walking corpse. Thankfully, the bone marrow in my leg had dislodged from my brief swim. A passing pickup truck flashed its high beams at me and pulled over. The driver was a real delight, a thick-bodied, shirtless hick staring at me with a quizzical expression. "What in God's name happened to you, man?" he boomed. I shook my head. "Can you just take me home, please?" I uttered. His brow furrowed. "You a cop?" I shook my head again. His expression lightened. "Well, get yourself in here, then. I reckon you ought to find a—" "Golly!" The man wrinkled his nose. "Would you smell like deer piss?" "Do I even want to know?" "No," I replied flatly. He shrugged and accelerated back onto the road as I settled in next to him. I think at one point he started going off about compost or something, but to me the ride back home was a long-didn't affair. I never wanted this to happen. All I had desired was deviation from the norm, an injection of abnormality from my dull life, a distraction from the misfortune. I could have gone the rest of my life without knowing about that coven of lost hominids in the woods. I know I could have. I harbored fleeting, treacherous illusions that I was being punished for my curiosity, for even daring to explore beyond the reaches of what I knew to be true, familiar, comforting. A hot shower did good to cleanse me of the mud and blood, but the foul thoughts in my head persisted with a vengeance. They were doing something to the does, training them, poisoning them, hypnotizing, whatever the term might be, inducing them to lactate to provide milk for their own young. That cocktail of urine and pheromones and whatever else they were cultivating, that had to have been their M.O. From what I saw in the bungalow I had collapsed, the women with sunken chests and weak midriffs, I could understand why they needed to turn to other animals to rear their offspring. They had to be involved to be inviolable for motherhood. As for the bucks that showed up, attracted by the inevitable chemical spills, To the pygmies, it would be more like gathering than hunting. To a scientist, the implications of this finding, a human subspecies co-evolving with native mammals, would have been groundbreaking. To me, it was disgustingly tragic. Natural selection and random chance had screwed them over, left them for dead in the forest, broken and wholly dependent on another species for their own procreation. I'd read about certain tribes in the Indo-Pacific reacting with visceral hostility to outsiders' attempts to contact. It was no stretch speculating how they'd remained undiscovered for so long. In other words, I wasn't lucky to have seen them. I was lucky to have gotten away. That night, as I sat in my living room in a state of sleepless shock, I knew that I'd be fine with keeping them a secret. Nature had done them dirty. Best to let them be, to let them die away, swallowed by the forest, and let nature run its thoughtless course. Things didn't quite work out that way. I only saw them in the light of the early morning. I hadn't moved from my dead-eyed perch for the entirety of the night. The sun had risen gradually, and I had no idea how long they'd been standing there. All I know is that I took a closer look through the back windows and jumped from my chair, for each one was occupied by a buck staring directly at me, their breath fogging the glass. My hand was pounding over my heart. I watched them as they tilted their heads back and bared their teeth, the same gesture the buck from last night had performed. I'd read that the behavior was called a flame-in response, displayed after smelling the pheromones of a receptive female. Oh, no. I breathed, backing away slowly. The driver had asked why I smelled of deer piss. Even a hot shower wasn't enough to expunge the scent from my skin. One of them brought its head back again and slammed it forward, its antlers jabbing the windowpane with a startling thud. It reared and thrust forward again, the very walls around me rattling from the force. The others joined in. I could see their eyes, buggy to the point of seeing their whites, crazed and incoherent as they drummed my windows with percussive insanity. I couldn't hold out for much longer. A pane shattered. I practically flew to my feet, my legs smarting from the arrow wound. I expected to see a buck halfway through my window, tossing its head and kicking its legs wildly. The deer all vanished. A single object sat on the carpet. An arrow made of bone. Before my eyes, a volley of arrows soared through the panes. The dawn air became heavy with projectiles and broken glass, with a cacophonous explosion of sound. The fragmented frame of my windows simply fell limp to the floor, and beyond the wreckage came a battalion of pygmies emerging from the forest in one onrushing flood. It was too much. Their demonic whispering chorus rooted me once more. My injured leg, pulsing and burning, refused to let the rest of my body move. They crawled into my home with spider-like limbs, their sneering, contorted faces gnarled with excitement. They surrounded me. I could see their ribs, the skeletal shadows on their chest, their swinish eyes, their shrunken manhoods dangling shamelessly. They pulled me to the floor, some standing on my limbs, some crouched next to me, pinning my hands or holding my head in place. I was too dazed to struggle. I could only watch as one of them stood over me, aiming his arm at my forehead like a rifle. There was a grungy sling hanging from his fingers. He inserted another arrow and pulled it the length of his arm, stretching the sling taut up to his shoulder. "Dear God," I whispered, but before he let go I noticed that the tip of the arrow was rounded and blunt, not at all sharp. They weren't aiming to kill. Then the sling snapped forth. There was a crunchy flash of white, a split-second fire in my brain, and everything went black. The first time I came around, All I saw were many naked marching legs. The light around me was gold and green, late morning. The forest again. I tried to move, but something had bound me entirely. Then a searing pressure dug underneath my neck, and the blackness returned. The second time, I finally felt the bruising pain in my skull. My vision was clear, but still darkened around the edges. I was back in the pit. The convoy of pygmies was hoisting me along. My sinuses were clogged, yet I could smell that familiar odor again. It was cold out, cold and airy, and I was nude. They'd stripped me of my damn clothes. As I squirmed, my head fell to the side, and I saw the face of the cliff was clustered with bucks, all watching me getting carried off. Go away. You're being used. You're being screwed over. I wanted to scream at them, but my voice had been lost somewhere miles back. As if detecting my resistance, another thumb pressed below my neck. The last thing I saw before blacking out the third time was the entrance to the drainage pipe, alive with the glow of torchlight. The walls around me were smooth, rounded, concrete, marked with symbols of ash and oil. The pipe was a funnel for the pygmies' noises, a torrent of whispers, clattering feet, slimy, chafing skin. I couldn't imagine what they were planning with me. They'd only been hostile up to this point. I never would have guessed it would have gone down the way it did. The space around me began to widen, and soon I found myself surrounded not just by my captors, but other pygmies as well, wearing expressions of primitive bewilderment. A few reached out and stroked me, their broken fingernails brushing across my cheeks and my sides. Soon my captors were being trailed by a parade of pygmies, all of whom were emitting low, subdued puffs of breath. Then it opened up entirely into a chamber the size of a cathedral. The concrete walls were studded with torches, casting the room into a permanent flicker. Metal tubes and dusty machinery snaked around and over us. Everything had been refurbished with a wild, branches, dead vines, bones, and skulls. What must have been the entire pygmy tribe had gathered in the chamber, and they rose up in a chorus of anxiety when they saw me shuttled in. They set me down, still bound tight, and I looked around. For roughly every half-dozen pygmy, there was a doe, all broken down and nursing a child. I averted my gaze, but what was on the ceiling terrified me even further. It was an elaborate fresco, a Sistine chapel of cave art, painted in the primordial colors of ash and berries and sap. Despite its arcane scrawl, I could still make out what it was depicting. There was a ring of deer, bucks and does. Within that ring was a circle of pygmies. Their stooped postures and pale pallor gave them away. And standing in the middle, towering above them all, was a faceless, godlike figure, sporting mighty antlers, its arms outstretched, an infant pygmy propped in each hand. My first naive, fear-cuddled thought, was that this was their deity they intended to sacrifice me to. I was the only one to escape after seeing them, and they'd brought me back to finish their hunt in grandiose fashion. They undid my bindings, and my limbs seemed to spring forth, almost rejoicing being freed. But instead they set upon them again, holding me in place, 3 on each arm and leg. Their collective strength was like boulders pressing onto my body. Movement was once again a lost prospect. I could vividly picture a blade digging into my ribs, them grabbing a hold of my heart, perhaps ripping it out and devouring it, still pulsing in its final beats of life. But what they brought out was the skull plate of a massive buck, with robust antlers of what must have been over 20 points. I panicked, imagining they were going to rake my flesh away with it. Instead, they placed it underneath my head. It curled over my scalp, fitting like a helmet. In a flash, I made the connection. It wasn't my flesh or blood they were after. The pygmies exploded with calls and hollers. The entire chamber rang, and particles of rock rained from the ceiling. Pheromones and blood were flecked onto my naked skin, anointing me. Raw intestines were draped over my chest like a lei. The smell was overwhelmingly rotten and fecal. Torch-toting pygmies marched around us in a circle, the flames merging into a solid, blurry line of yellow. One of the females sauntered forth. A flare of blush bloomed across her pallid skin. Her nipples were erect like bullets. She placed her palms on my face, red and sticky with blood. There was the wet, cold, loving prod of a tongue. Everything went numb. My throat seized up. My muscles surrendered to her unrequited advance. She moved down to my waist. I don't think I need to recount the details. They got what they wanted. They had fulfilled whatever demented prophecy that was chalked on their walls. They had dumped me in a meadow. I awoke to the rays of the afternoon sun and the reeking odor of putrefaction. There were violets growing around me, brushing my skin, as if consoling me for my traumatic experience. By some bad stroke of fate, the same shirtless pickup truck guy saw me wandering naked on the side of the road. He was rather blasé about the circumstances. I shouldn't have been surprised in retrospect. I'm sure he would have invited Cthulhu into his truck if it meant he could further discuss compost with someone. To think only that previous night I'd been lamenting their ability to rear young on their own. Apparently they had, too, much longer than I had. I can't blame them for mustering the initiative to do something about it, one last saving grace to cement the continuation of their species. But I can't say I hope our children will see the light of day. The thought of my legacy, some twisted hybrid abominations running amok through the woods, bred for the sole purpose of displacing their parents and becoming an independent generation, well, it disturbs me to the depths of my soul. I don't know if their mothers would even be able to deliver our kin. They must have thought of that, too. My first partner wasn't the only one during the ritual. Now, I know talking about it's the only way to cope. The only way to attempt to accept what happened to me. Because I can't be angry at them, nor look down at them with disgust or shame. My trauma, their lust and delusion, they were just instances in nature's sweeping tide. It's what it intended. No circumstances, no reason. It just was.
Chilling tales for dark nights.